20 years of dinner parties, and I still counted the forks. Not because I might get it wrong. I hadn't gotten it wrong since our first anniversary, but because counting gave my hands a purpose that the rest of me had lost somewhere around year 12. 4 settings tonight: the Hargroves from Richard's firm, matching steak knives, the good linen napkins, the Riedel glasses we received as a wedding gift and only brought out when company mattered. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, held it there until the small crescent of pain steadied me, then released. The orchid on the sideboard had a petal going brown at the edge. I snipped it with the kitchen scissors and slid the dead thing into my apron pocket before anyone could see. The house looked the way the house always looked before these evenings, staged. Every surface wiped, every cushion arranged at the same angle, the candle on the mantel releasing its curated scent of fig and cedar, the chandelier scattered tiny rainbows across the ceiling. I had cleaned each crystal pendant by hand that morning, standing on a step stool with a microfiber cloth and a spray bottle of vinegar water, working through 114 drops of leaded glass while the coffee grew cold on the counter below. I did not enjoy these dinners. I had stopped enjoying them sometime during the second Bush administration. Around the same period, I stopped reading novels and started reading the nutritional labels on cereal boxes with the intensity of a graduate thesis. But the dinners kept happening because Richard needed them, and what Richard needed had a way of becoming the weather, something you dressed for and lived inside, regardless of preference. The doorbell rang at 7:03. Richard was already in the foyer, adjusting the knot of his tie in the hallway mirror. His charcoal suit sat on his shoulders the way good tailoring does, like a second opinion about the man wearing it. He caught my reflection behind him and smiled. It was the smile he kept for audiences. "Looking lovely, sweetheart," he said it without turning around. I smoothed the front of my dress, a slate gray sheath I'd bought 4 years ago for a fundraiser I couldn't remember, and opened the door. The Hargroves came in with wine and noise. Tom pumped Richard's hand and launched into a story about a boat he was considering buying. Linda pressed her lips to my cheek, leaving a faint smear of something pink and floral, and told me the entryway smelled divine. I took their coats. I offered drinks. I moved through the rituals with the fluency of someone who had been rehearsing the same part for 2 decades. Dinner was rack of lamb with a rosemary crust, roasted fingerling potatoes, and haricots verts I had blanched and shocked in ice water to keep their color. The lamb was pink at the center. I served it on the white platters we kept on the top shelf, the ones too heavy for my shoulders but too expensive to replace with something practical. Richard held court. He always held court. He leaned back in his chair at the head of the table, the Patek Philippe catching the candlelight every time he gestured, and he told the story about the Mercer deal, the one where the other firm's counsel had accidentally sent their entire strategy memo to Richard's assistant. The pause before the punchline, the self-deprecating hand to the chest, the warm baritone that made you lean in even when you had heard the ending 3 times before. Tom laughed. Linda laughed. I cut my lamb into smaller and smaller pieces. Richard raised his glass. "To good company, good food, and the woman who makes it all possible." He extended the glass toward me. Everyone turned. I smiled. The muscles in my face knew the shape of it. Lips up, teeth partially visible, eyes narrowed just enough to suggest warmth without risking any emotion that might be read as excessive. I had built this smile over time, like scar tissue, and it performed its function. I pressed my thumbnail into my finger under the table. The small pain bloomed, familiar as a heartbeat, and I held it while the glasses clinked and the compliments washed over me like lukewarm water. Dessert. A tart tatin I had caramelized twice because the first batch of sugar seized, and coffee, and a 40-minute conversation about property taxes that I contributed to with 3 sentences and 2 nods. Richard's hand found the small of my back once, briefly, when the Hargroves were putting on their coats. The touch was light and automatic, the kind of contact that had nothing to do with the person being touched. At the door, Linda squeezed my hands and told me I was a treasure. Tom told Richard he was a lucky man. Richard straightened his cufflinks, the small, habitual adjustment I had cataloged 15 years ago but never mentioned, and agreed. I stood at the threshold and watched the taillights shrink down the driveway, two red dots dissolving into the suburban dark. Behind me, Richard's footsteps crossed the foyer toward the stairs. No pause, no backward glance. No, that went well, or the lamb was perfect, or even the perfunctory good night that would have cost him nothing and meant equally little. Just the measured sound of Italian leather on hardwood, ascending. I closed the front door, the lock clicked. The house exhaled into silence, the particular silence of a large home after the guests have gone, when every surface still holds the ghost of conversation, but the rooms themselves have emptied out completely. The dining room table still held the debris of the evening. Plates smeared with sauce, crumpled napkins, a wine stain on the linen I would need to soak in cold water before it set. I began clearing them, stacking in the order that made the walk to the kitchen efficient, dinner plates on the bottom, salad plates next, the bread plates balanced on top like an afterthought. I did not cry. Crying required a specificity of grief, a particular wound, a singular loss, and what I carried did not have edges sharp enough to draw tears. It was duller than that, rounder, the kind of ache that settles into the architecture of your chest and becomes load-bearing, so that removing it would mean the whole structure might shift. Upstairs, the shower turned on. I heard the muffled percussion of water against tile, Richard's nightly routine commencing exactly on schedule. In 11 minutes, the water would stop. In 14, the bedroom light would go off. I knew this the way I knew the pattern of the ceiling cracks above our bed. Through years of lying still in the dark, cataloging the geography of a life that had quietly stopped, including me. I rinsed the last glass, set it upside down on the drying rack, and untied my apron. The dead petal was still in the pocket. I pulled it out and held it under the kitchen light, thin, brown-edged, papery, a thing that had been beautiful that morning and was refuse by nightfall. I dropped it in the trash, turned off the kitchen light, and climbed the stairs in the dark. The bedroom door was already closed. Through the gap beneath it, no light. I turned the knob and lay down on my side of a king-size bed that had never felt larger. I awoke to those same ceiling cracks, bathed now in the flat, unforgiving gray light of a Tuesday morning, listening to the rhythmic breathing of a man who was already gone. Beside me, the mattress shifted. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his back to me, already slipping his feet into his leather loafers. He did not turn around. He reached for his watch on the nightstand, the metal clasp snapping shut with a sharp click that punctuated the silence. I lay perfectly still, matching my breathing to the low hum of the central heating, watching the rise and fall of his shoulders under his crisp white undershirt. He stood, retrieved his suit jacket from the valet stand, and walked out of the bedroom. The door clicked shut behind him. I stared at the space he had just occupied. A faint trace of his shaving cream lingered in the air, a sterile, manufactured pine scent that I had bought for him in bulk 3 months ago. I threw off the duvet. The hardwood floor chilled the soles of my bare feet as I crossed the room to pull back the curtains. Outside, the suburban street was empty, identical manicured lawns stretching down the block under a low, overcast sky. I moved to the bathroom. The mirror was still fogged at the edges. I turned on the cold tap, cupped the water in my hands, and splashed my face. Drops ran down my chin, soaking into the collar of my cotton nightgown. I grabbed a towel, pressing it against my skin until the chill subsided. Today was dry cleaning day. Every Tuesday for the last 14 years, I gathered Richard's worn suits from the week before and drove them to the strip mall on Elm Street. It was a chore etched into the muscle memory of our marriage. I walked into his walk-in closet. The scent of cedar and old wool was heavy in the confined space. His clothes hung in perfectly spaced intervals, sorted by color, then season, a man of immaculate order. I pulled down the navy pinstripe suit he had worn on his trip to Chicago last Thursday. The fabric was heavy, holding the shape of his shoulders. I laid the jacket across the ironing board in the center of the closet and began the ritual. Pockets must be emptied. The dry cleaner charged an extra $2 if they found so much as a stray mint wrapper, a petty penalty Richard abhorred. I slipped my fingers into the left front pocket, empty. I moved to the right. A single metallic paperclip. I set it on the shelf, then the breast pocket. My fingertips brushed against something crisp, not a business card. The texture was too thin, crinkling softly under my touch. I pulled it out. It was a small square of paper, folded tightly into quarters. The edges were sharp, precise, as if the person who folded it had pressed their thumb along the crease multiple times to ensure it stayed flat. Richard folded his receipts. He folded everything. I carried the small square out of the closet and into the bedroom, where the light was brighter. I stood by the window, the gray morning illuminating my hands. I placed my left thumbnail against the pad of my right index finger, pressing hard. The sharp sting anchored my feet to the floorboards, a habit I had cultivated since childhood to keep the room from spinning. I slowly unfolded the paper. It was a receipt, printed on thick thermal stock. At the top, the logo of the Sterling Hotel, downtown Seattle. My eyes dropped to the dates, Thursday to Saturday of last week, the exact dates of his Chicago conference. I stared at the ink. It was stark, black, and undeniable. 2 nights in a king suite, room service for 2, charged at 11:45 p.m. on Friday. The total was circled in blue ink, Richard's blue ink, the same pen he kept clipped to his leather portfolio. The low hum of the central heating suddenly sounded like a roar. My chest tightened, the air leaving my lungs in a slow, jagged exhale. Seattle, he had been 3,000 miles away from Chicago. The cold that had cloaked me for months shattered like a brittle sheet of ice. In its place, a freezing wave of adrenaline flooded my veins. My hands trembled, vibrating with a frequency I could not control. I pressed my thumbnail deeper into my index finger, digging the crescent edge into the skin until a dull ache radiated up my wrist. It wasn't enough. The trembling continued. I looked up from the receipt to the empty side of the bed. The sheets were still slightly rumpled, bearing the indentation of his body, the pillow where his head had rested, the nightstand where his watch had sat. Everything was undisturbed, an impeccable stage set constructed for an audience of one, a performance meticulously maintained over breakfast coffee and evening routines. I walked over to the bed and smoothed my hand over his pillow. The fabric was cool to the touch. The sheer scale of the deception pressed against my ribs, making each breath an effort. It wasn't a drunken mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a king suite in Seattle. It was room service for 2. It was a receipt folded into exact quarters, tucked away in a breast pocket, with the confidence of a man who believed his wife would never look, or worse, would simply look away. I turned back to the window, the receipt still gripped in my hand. The paper crumpled slightly under the pressure of my fingers. The methodical, unyielding order of my life was a hollow shell. I stared out at the identical lawns, the quiet street, the safe suburban enclosure I had tended for 2 decades. The silence in the room grew louder, buzzing against my eardrums. I carefully folded the receipt back along its original creases, quarter by quarter, until it was a small, precise square again. I slipped it into the pocket of my nightgown. A dense, heavy stone dropped into the pit of my stomach, settling there permanently. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, the air thick with the smell of roasted garlic and the dense, heavy stone that had settled permanently into the pit of my stomach. The heavy brass tumbler of the front door lock clicked at exactly 6:45. Footsteps echoed in the foyer, followed by the familiar measured thud of Richard's leather briefcase hitting the hardwood floor. I smoothed the crisp creases of the linen napkin across my lap, my right hand resting over the small, perfectly quartered square of thermal paper hidden in my skirt pocket. Richard walked into the dining room. He removed his suit jacket, draped it perfectly over the back of the mahogany chair opposite me, and loosened his tie exactly half an inch. His routine remained untouched, an immovable object against the frantic, vibrating energy pulsing under my skin. My pulse hammered against my throat, a frantic, uneven rhythm. Traffic on the I-90 was a nightmare, he said. His voice was clipped, the tone he reserved for private spaces, stripped of the warm baritone he used to charm boardrooms. He sat down and reached for his water glass. "Did you take my navy suit to the cleaners?" "Yes," I said. My voice sounded thin, stretched taut over a hollow drum. My vocal cords felt brittle, ready to snap under the crushing weight of the lie. "This morning," he nodded, slicing his steak with the precise, methodical movements of a surgeon. The silver knife scraped against the porcelain plate, a sharp grating sound that set my teeth on edge. I watched him eat. I watched the man who had shared my bed for 14 years, searching for a crack in his armor, a flicker of guilt around the eyes, a hesitation in his chewing. There was nothing. His face was a mask of relaxed entitlement, as if he had just spent 3 days reviewing spreadsheets instead of ruining our marriage. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the sharp sting to ground me. The receipt burned through the fabric of my pocket like a lit match against my thigh. I needed to force the lie into the space between us. "How was the weather in Chicago?" I asked. Richard paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He did not look up. "Cold, windy. You know how the lake effect gets in November? Did you stay near the office?" He placed the fork down, his eyes lifted from his plate, meeting mine. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, pressing down on my chest until my lungs burned. He reached his left hand across his chest, his fingers finding the right cuff of his shirt. He pinched the silver cufflink, rotating it slightly to ensure it aligned perfectly with the buttonhole. It was the tell, the same meticulous adjustment he made before delivering a calculated statement, a habit I had catalogued 15 years ago. "Sarah," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing patience, "is this an interrogation? I am asking about your trip." I kept my hands under the table, gripping the napkin until my knuckles turned white and the joints ached. It was a work conference. I sat in fluorescent-lit rooms for 3 days listening to regional managers argue about Q4 projections. He picked up his fork again. "It wasn't a vacation." "I found a receipt," I said. The words tumbled out faster than I intended. The stone in my stomach lurched upward, bringing a wave of sour nausea to the back of my throat. "In your navy suit." The scraping of his knife stopped. He chewed his food slowly, deliberately, before swallowing. He did not flinch. He did not widen his eyes. He reached for his linen napkin, wiped the corners of his mouth, and set it neatly beside his plate. "A receipt," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "For the Sterling Hotel," I said. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. My vision narrowed, the edges of the room blurring into gray. "In Seattle." Richard leaned back in his chair. He surveyed me, his gaze moving over my face with the clinical detachment of a man appraising a damaged piece of furniture. He watched me the way a mathematician examines a flawed equation. There was no panic. There was only a cold, transactional calculation. The betrayal sat in my chest like a physical blow. The heat drained from my face, leaving my cheeks numb and cold. Every shared memory curdled in my gut. "Sweetheart," he sighed, acting as though my devastation was merely a clerical error. "I had a layover. The firm booked the wrong flight path. I had to stay the night in Seattle on the way back. It was an administrative error. I didn't believe I needed to burden you with the minutiae of my travel logistics." "A 2-night layover?" I asked, my voice rising, fracturing at the edges into a jagged rasp. "With room service for 2? He straightened his other cufflink. His eyes turned completely flat. "Sarah, you are spiraling over clerical errors. I work 80-hour weeks to provide this house, this life for you. Amostas, do not sit at this table and accuse me of things beyond your grasp." The dismissal was absolute. 14 years of smoothing his path, of ironing his shirts and curating his perfect life, dissolved into a single patronizing sigh. A violent tremor started in my knees and traveled upward, a silent earthquake threatening to shatter my bones. A sharp, cold fear gripped me as I realized the utter despair of my situation. To him, I was merely a nuisance, a subordinate stepping out of line. I stared at him, the adrenaline draining from my veins, replaced by a chilling clarity that froze the blood in my chest. If I pulled the receipt from my pocket now, if I screamed and pointed at the dates, he would twist it. He would use my rage against me, paint me as hysterical, and dismantle my life before I could pack a suitcase. Passionate fury would not win a war against a man operating a ledger. My jaw ached with the brutal physical force of keeping my mouth shut. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the skin nearly broke. I relaxed my grip on the napkin beneath the table. The furious, frantic energy that had sustained me all day solidified into unbreakable ice, coating my spine. Showing him my hand now would be a fatal mistake. He anticipated an emotional outburst. He relied on the good, enduring wife who could be bullied back into submission. I would grant him that illusion. I picked up my own fork. I cut a small piece of steak, bringing it to my mouth. It tasted like a mouthful of dry dirt, bitter on my tongue, but I forced my raw throat to swallow. "You are right," I said, keeping my voice low and measured, hiding the tremor. "I apologize. I misunderstood." Richard smiled, a small, tight curve of his lips. "It is fine, sweetheart. Just let it go." He returned to his meal, his posture relaxed, his victory secured. He believed he had silenced a hysterical wife. He did not realize he had just handed me the rules of the game. Under the table, my hand slid back to my pocket, my fingers tracing the sharp, folded edge of the paper. Let him have his dinner. Let him have his arrogance. The war had just begun, and he had no idea I was already armed. "Sit down, Sarah," Eleanor instructed. Her soft, grandmotherly voice coated the steel trap waiting to snap shut around my ankles. She sat on the center cushion of the pristine white sofa, her hands clasped together in her lap with a serene smile. I watched her. She wore a floral silk blouse and a pearl necklace, the disguise of a frail matriarch hiding the iron will of an architect. The scent of her expensive gardenia perfume mingled with the smell of old paper in the room. Richard stood by the fireplace mantel, his posture rigid. He reached his left hand across his chest, his fingers finding the right cuff of his shirt. He pinched the silver cufflink, rotating it slightly to ensure it aligned perfectly with the buttonhole. The calculated statement was coming. I stood in the archway holding a silver tray with 3 cups of Earl Grey tea. The china rattled against the metal surface, a sharp clatter that broke the heavy silence. The dark shadow of the afternoon sun stretched across the Persian rug. The immovable stone in my stomach turned to ice, radiating a freezing cold ache through my ribs. I carried the tray to the glass coffee table, my movements mechanical. The texture of the silver tray dug into my damp palms. I took my seat in the armchair opposite them. Richard reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and extracted a thick, folded sheaf of legal documents. He tossed the stack onto the glass table. The papers hit the surface with a heavy thud, creating a dull sound echoing in the quiet room. "What is this?" I asked, my voice a thin, brittle string stretching to its limit. The bitter taste of bile rose in the back of my throat. "We need to discuss the future, sweetheart," Richard said. I heard the patronizing patience dripping from his words. He did not glance at me. He stared at the documents, treating the interaction as a mundane board meeting. "It is time to separate our paths." The air left my lungs. I stared at the bold, stark lettering on the top page. It was a declaration of trust. The black color of the ink was absolute. "You are divorcing me?" The words scraped my throat, rough and jagged. The betrayal struck my chest like a physical blow. The hotel receipt in Seattle was a minor symptom. This stack of paper was the fatal disease. Eleanor unclasped her hands and reached forward to pick up her teacup, acting as though my destruction was a trivial inconvenience. "Oh dear, do not use such theatrical words. Richard is simply restructuring his assets to protect the family interests." "Family interests?" My gaze snapped to her. I caught a whiff of her sweet tea. "I have been his wife for 14 years. "You have been a tenant," Eleanor corrected. Her voice was smooth, masking the venom. "And the lease has expired." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Sarah, listen to me. I transferred the deed of this house into a revocable trust 3 months ago. The joint accounts were consolidated into my primary holding company last week. I left 30,000 in your personal checking account to cover your transition period. My pulse hammered against my temples, a frantic, deafening drumbeat. 30,000, a fraction of the empire I had helped him build by managing his life, his schedules, his family obligations, sacrificing every ambition of my own to smooth his path. The sheer weight of the loss pressed down on my shoulders, pinning me to the chair. You stole my home, I managed to whisper. I protected my investments, Richard corrected. His eyes were flat, completely devoid of any warm light. You will pack your belongings by Friday. The moving company will transport them to an apartment I secured for you in the valley. The lease is paid for 6 months. It is a generous settlement, sweetheart. Do not make this difficult. I looked from Richard to his mother. They operated like a flawless machine, a predator and its architect, dissecting my life with the cold arithmetic of a ledger. The sheer scale of their cruelty left me hollow. My hands shook, vibrating with a frantic energy I could not suppress. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, tightening my grip, digging the crescent edge deep into the skin until the sharp sting anchored me. You cannot do this, I said, forcing my raw throat to push the words out. The law protects marital assets. Eleanor took a delicate sip of her tea, savoring the flavor. The law protects those who prepare, dear. Richard's legal team has been working on this structure for 2 years. You signed the foundational documents disguised as tax returns last April. You handed him the keys to your own cage. You were always so eager to please, Sarah, never questioning the paperwork, never reading the fine print. It made you a wonderful hostess, but a terrible partner. 2 years, the room spun, the corners blurring into a hazy gray. The Seattle receipt was a drop of water in an ocean of deception. Samji's half. I twite my Eucharisti. For 2 years, he had smiled at me over breakfast, kissed my cheek before work, and meticulously dismantled my future. The grief washed over me in a suffocating wave, drowning the frantic anger, leaving only a freezing, terrifying despair. I was 45 years old, sitting in a house I no longer owned, staring at a husband who had erased me from his life with a pen. I stared at the thick stack of papers on the glass table. I did not reach out to touch them. I did not cry. Crying would only validate their victory. I sat in silence, bearing the crushing burden of my own vulnerability. The war I believed I had started yesterday was already over. They had stripped me of my armor, my resources, my ground. Richard checked the silver watch on his wrist. I have a flight to catch. Read the documents, Sarah. Sign the acknowledgement on the last page. The attorneys will handle the rest. He stood up, kissed his mother on the cheek, and walked out the front door without looking back. Eleanor remained on the sofa, finishing her tea in the suffocating silence. I looked down at my trembling hands, a sickening terror spreading through my veins. The man I had served for 14 years had vanished, leaving nothing but an empty shell and a terrifying question: what would I do now that I had nothing left to lose? You packed one suitcase, Grace stated, her voice flat and loud over the hum of her espresso machine. One suitcase for 14 years of marriage. She stood in her expansive kitchen, pointing her entire right hand at the pathetic black rolling bag sitting on the rough texture of the sisal rug. The dark shadow of the Seattle evening pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the warm glow of the pendant lights above her island. I watched her push a ceramic mug under the coffee spout. Her movements were sharp, precise, crackling with an energy that vibrated across the room. I sat on a smooth leather bar stool, staring at the swirling patterns in the marble countertop. The bitter taste of failure coated the back of my throat, thick and suffocating. The cold dampness of the rain still clung to my wool coat, carrying the sharp smell of wet pavement and the metallic odor of the city. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, tightening my grip until the sharp physical ache offered a momentary distraction from the crushing weight in my chest. He gave me until Friday, I said. My voice was a thin, fragile whisper, barely breaking the silence. But the moving company arrived at noon. His assistant supervised them. They packed the art, the silver, the good china, everything I bought, everything I curated. They put it all into boxes marked with his holding company's name. I had 20 minutes to take my clothes. Grace slammed her open palm on the counter. The sharp clatter of the ceramic mug hitting the stone made me jump. And you let them? Sarah Ann, the law protects marital assets. You do not just walk out the front door because a man in a tailored suit tells you the lease is up. I did not have a choice. I forced the words past the raw, jagged edge of my throat. The house is in a trust. The accounts are drained. I signed the foundational documents 2 years ago, disguised as tax returns. He planned this. He engineered my exit the way a demolition expert wires a building. The scent of dark roast coffee filled the air, rich and heavy, a stark contrast to the sterile, chilling emptiness hollowed out inside me. Grace walked around the kitchen island. She did not reach out to touch my shoulder. She accepted that a single gesture of pity would shatter the fragile ice holding my spine together. She leaned against the counter, her dark eyes locking onto mine with fierce, unyielding intensity. "So you just hand him the keys and take an Uber to my apartment?" she asked. The anger in her tone was not directed at me. It was a shield she threw over my deep humiliation. The shame burned through my cheeks, a hot, searing color rising to my skin. Admitting defeat, stripping away the armor of the perfect, enduring wife in front of another person, was a massive betrayal of my mother's teachings. Good wives endure. Good wives do not end up on their friend's doorstep with a single piece of luggage. "I have $30,000 in my checking account," I whispered, the sound barely audible in the quiet kitchen. He left it for my transition. To him, I am an employee taking a severance package. Grace crossed her arms. $30,000. Richard makes that in a Tuesday afternoon. It is a rounding error. It is all I have, I said. The sheer despair of the statement struck me like a physical blow. The loss of the house, the betrayal, the lies, it all coalesced into a singular, undeniable truth. I was 45 years old, and my entire existence fit into a canvas bag measuring 22 by 14 inches. I looked at the black suitcase. It sat by the door, acting as though my devastation was a normal consequence of a Tuesday afternoon. "You are going to fight him," Grace instructed. It was not a suggestion. It was a command issued with the authority of a woman who had clawed her way out of her own marital wreckage 6 years prior. "With what?" I asked, a bitter flavor staining my tongue. "With $30,000? His legal team bills that in a week. He operates like a machine, Grace. He does not make mistakes. He anticipated an emotional outburst. He expects me to spiral, to drain my meager funds fighting a war I have already lost." Grace uncrossed her arms. She pointed her entire hand at my chest. "He expects you to be quiet, Sar. He expects the woman who smoothed his path, ironed his shirts, and smiled at his dinner parties to fade into the background. He is banking on your pride keeping you silent, because silence is cheap." The words landed with heavy, undeniable force. I stared at her, the freezing terror in my veins warring with the first spark of a different emotion. Not anger. Not yet. It was something colder, sharper. The burden of being the perfect wife had been lifted, leaving an agonizing void, but also an untethered freedom. "I need a lawyer," I said, the words tasting like ash. "A ruthless one." "I will make the calls tomorrow morning," Grace said. She reached across the counter, sliding the warm coffee mug toward me. "Drink this. Take the guest room. Cry if you must, but be done with it by sunrise." I wrapped my damp hands around the smooth ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into my numb fingers. I did not cry. Crying was for the woman who lived in the house with the Persian rugs and the carefully arranged cushions. That woman was gone, erased by a signature on a trust document. I took a sip of the dark, bitter liquid. I looked past Grace, staring through the rain-streaked windows at the sprawling city lights below. Richard believed he had legally severed me from his life, reducing my 14 years of service to a single piece of luggage and a modest checking account. He believed he had won. But as the sharp ache in my chest slowly hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve, I stared into the endless shadow of the Seattle night, burdened by a terrifying question: what is a woman capable of when she has nothing left to lose? I unzipped the black canvas suitcase, the metal teeth parting with a harsh, grating sound that echoed against the bare walls of the guest room. The morning sun carved sharp, geometric lines of light across the pale hardwood floor. Outside the narrow window, the Seattle skyline was obscured by a thick, damp fog, carrying the faint, metallic odor of the shipping yards. I stared down at the meager contents of the bag: 3 pairs of slacks, 4 silk blouses, a single cashmere sweater, its soft texture a mocking reminder of the sprawling, temperature-controlled walk-in closet I had abandoned less than 24 hours ago. The sheer weight of the loss pressed heavily against my ribs, a dull, relentless ache that made every breath a conscious effort. I lifted a blouse, tracing the smooth fabric with the tips of my fingers. The scent of my old life, a blend of expensive lavender detergent and the faint smell of Richard's cedarwood cologne, clung to the collar. I squeezed the fabric, my grip tightening until my knuckles turned a bruised, bloodless color. The betrayal was still fresh, a raw wound sitting just beneath my ribs, throbbing in the heavy silence of the room. "Coffee," a voice barked from the doorway. I glanced up. Grace stood leaning against the frame, holding 2 oversized ceramic mugs. The hum of the city traffic below served as a constant baseline to her sharp, unyielding energy. She wore faded denim jeans and an oversized college sweatshirt, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and manicured appearances that had defined my social circle for the past 14 years. "Thank you," I managed to whisper, my throat still rough from a night spent staring at the dark ceiling. Grace walked in and set 1 mug on the small wooden desk. I heard the ceramic base hit the wood with a sharp clatter. "You look like a ghost, Sar. Drink it, black, the way you need it." I walked over and picked up the mug. The hot porcelain warmed my cold palms. I took a sip. The bitter taste of the dark roast washed over my tongue, grounding me in the immediate physical present. "I have an appointment for you at 11, Grace said, pointing her entire hand at the small desk calendar she had placed next to the mug. "Marcus Vance, he handled my divorce. He is expensive, he is ruthless, and he does not play nice with men who hide assets in revocable trusts." I stared at the name scribbled in black ink. "I cannot afford him, Grace. I told you I have $30,000. That is a rounding error in a corporate divorce." "You are not paying him today," Grace stated, her tone flat and brooking no argument. "He works on contingency when he smells blood in the water, and Richard Mitchell just dumped an ocean of blood into the water. You are going to walk into that office, sit in the expensive leather chair, and you are going to give Marcus every single detail of your husband's financial architecture." "Richard handles the finances," I said, the words slipping out automatically, the conditioned response of the compliant wife. "He always managed the portfolios." Grace crossed her arms. "Stop acting as though you were merely a guest in your own marriage. You hosted the dinners. You organized the fundraisers. You sat at the table while he and his partners drank scotch and bragged about their offshore accounts. You listened. I know you, Sarah Ann. You never miss a detail." She was right. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness swallow the immediate surroundings. The memories surfaced, distinct and sharp. I recalled the precise cadence of Richard's voice when he lied to a client. I remembered the heavy thud of the mahogany drawer where he kept the private ledgers he believed I never touched. I pictured the blue folders, the offshore routing numbers I had memorized because I had a talent for numbers he never bothered to acknowledge. The grief that had paralyzed me yesterday began to fracture, cracking under the sudden, searing heat of a new emotion. It was a quiet, unyielding rage. I opened my eyes and looked at the black suitcase. It was a pathetic symbol of defeat, a visual representation of the burden I was supposed to carry quietly into obscurity. Richard expected me to vanish. He expected the humiliation to break my spirit, to keep me compliant and silent in the cheap apartment he had rented for me in the valley. He treated my silence as a weakness, a blank ledger he could erase. He uses a boutique firm in the Caymans, I said, my voice losing its fragile tremor. For the discretionary bonuses, he transfers them in small increments to avoid the flagging thresholds. He assumes I never looked at the statements because I always handed him the mail without opening it. Grace smiled, a fierce, feral expression that lit up her dark eyes. There she is. He also has a secondary trust under his mother's maiden name, I continued, the words coming faster now, the bitter flavor in my mouth replaced by something sharp and metallic. Tense Eleanor oversaw the transfers. She signed the proxy documents every Thanksgiving when they claimed to be discussing the holiday menu. Marcus is going to love you, Grace said. She reached out and tapped the wooden desk. Finish unpacking. The guest room is yours for as long as you need it. We treat this as a base of operations. We do not cry over the china, Sarah. We take the house. I looked down at the mug in my hands. The warmth seeped into my skin, melting the residual ice that had coated my spine since yesterday afternoon. The despair was still there, lurking in the shadows, but it no longer dictated my movements. I set the mug down next to the manila folder Grace had provided. I turned back to the suitcase. I did not fold the cashmere sweater. I did not arrange the slacks by color. I grabbed the clothes and shoved them into the small dresser with a rough, abrupt motion, the harsh sound of the fabric scraping against the wood echoing in the room. I slammed the empty suitcase shut. I pushed it deep into the dark shadow of the closet, out of sight. I was no longer the perfect wife waiting for permission to exist. The man who had meticulously dismantled my life had made a critical miscalculation. He had stripped me of my armor, yes, but he had also removed the very chains that kept me docile. I stood by the window watching the rain wash the dirt from the glass, staring into the sprawling city that held the empire I helped build. Richard believed he had legally severed me from his life, leaving me with an empty future and a terrifying question. What happens when a woman decides to take it all back? Emotion. $30,000, Daniel Parks said, his voice fast and precise as he stared at the bank statement. He left you a rounding error. He sat behind a battered mahogany desk, cluttered with manila folders and empty takeout containers. The sharp smell of stale ramen and black ink dominated the cramped office. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, temperature-controlled law firms Richard frequented, where the scent of lemon polish usually masked the metallic odor of corporate theft. Daniel pushed his thick-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose with his middle finger, a habitual gesture that made him look perpetually disheveled. He was 38, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt and a tie loosened to the middle of his chest. I sat in a worn leather armchair opposite him, gripping the smooth wooden armrests until my knuckles turned a bruised, bloodless color. The rain from the Seattle morning still clung to my coat, leaving damp patches on the dark leather. My friend Grace said you handle these types of cases. Grace sent you to Marcus, Daniel corrected. I heard the rhythmic hum of caffeine and adrenaline vibrating in his voice. Marcus retired to Florida 6 months ago. I bought the practice. And yes, I handle these cases, but usually my clients have more than 30 grand to start a war. The bitter taste of humiliation coated my tongue. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the sharp physical ache to ground me. The sheer weight of my situation pressed down on my shoulders, a heavy, suffocating burden. Then I am wasting your time, I offered in a thin whisper. I reached forward to collect the single piece of paper, the only proof I had of the meager funds Richard had deposited. Daniel's hand shot out, his fingers pressing flat against the document. His movements were quick, vibrating with a fierce energy. I did not say that, he said. He looked at me, his eyes losing their impatient edge. There was no pity in his gaze. He examined me the way a mechanic assesses a damaged engine, looking for the spark, not the rust. My mother got a settlement just like this 20 years ago. Her husband transferred the house to a shell company and drained the joint accounts. She spent a decade paying off the debt he left behind. I despise men who use the law as a weapon against their wives. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. I watched him carefully. The freezing despair that had paralyzed me since yesterday began to crack. For 14 years, I had hosted dinners, curated the perfect home, and smoothed Richard's path, sacrificing my own ambitions to become an invisible asset. The betrayal had left me hollow, stripped of my armor and my resources. But sitting in this cluttered office, facing a lawyer who ate cold noodles at his desk, a genuine spark of defiance ignited in my chest. Richard Mitchell is a senior partner at Vanguard Financial, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the quiet room. He uses a boutique firm in the Caymans for discretionary bonuses. He transfers them in increments of exactly $9,900 to avoid the flagging thresholds. Daniel stopped pushing his glasses. He stared at me. The rhythmic clatter of the street noise outside the window faded into the background. Structuring, that is a federal offense. He also has a secondary trust under his mother's maiden name, I continued, the words flowing faster now. The rust was falling off my mind, the long-abandoned accounting skills I had buried to play the perfect hostess, finally breaking the surface. Eleanor oversaw the transfers. She signed the proxy documents every Thanksgiving. I saw the blue folders. I memorized the routing numbers. Daniel grabbed a yellow legal pad and a pen. Give me the numbers. I closed my eyes. The dark shadow of the memory materialized. I recited the string of digits, my voice a low, measured hum in the small room. The harsh sound of his pen scratching against the paper echoed against the walls. He wrote furiously, his middle finger occasionally pushing his glasses back up his nose. He engineered my exit 2 years ago, I said, opening my eyes. He disguised the foundational documents of the revocable trust as tax returns. I signed them. I handed him the keys to my own cage. Duress and fraud, Daniel muttered, staring at the yellow pad. If we can prove he structured the Cayman deposits while actively funneling marital assets into a trust you signed under false pretenses, we can pierce the trust. We can freeze his primary accounts. He looked up at me. The warm glow of the desk lamp highlighted the fierce determination in his eyes. He expected you to cry, Sarah. He expected you to take the 30 grand and disappear into the valley. He treated you like a liability he could write off. He treated my silence as a weakness, I corrected, a cold, unbreakable resolve settling into my chest. The crushing burden of the past 14 years was gone. The grief was still there, but it was no longer a heavy weight pinning me down. It was fuel. It was a raw, burning energy, a flavor far sharper than defeat. Can we win? I asked, gripping the rough texture of the manila folder I had brought. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He tapped the pen against his desk, the sound sharp and deliberate. He smiled, a feral expression that mirrored the awakening rage inside me. We are not just going to win, Sarah. We are going to dismantle him. We are going to take the house, the accounts, the Cayman bonuses, and every piece of silver he packed into those boxes. But I need more. I need the exact dates of the Thanksgiving transfers. I nodded. The chill in my blood had vanished, replaced by a scorching heat. I was no longer the compliant wife. I was the architect of his ruin. I will give you the dates, I promised. I will give you everything. Daniel set the pen down. The silence returned, heavy with the promise of war. The terrified, numb woman who had dragged a single suitcase into Grace's apartment was gone. In her place sat someone Richard Mitchell had never met, someone who held the match that would burn his empire to the ground. I looked at the yellow legal pad, staring at the precise, undeniable truth. Richard had left his ledger wide open, and I was about to audit every single secret. A Mosin. It is not just the Caymans, Daniel said, his voice flat, dropping a thick stack of printed ledgers onto the desk. He has been moving money since your 7th anniversary. I heard the heavy binders hit the battered mahogany with a sharp, resonant clatter. The sound echoed in the cramped office, cutting through the low hum of the ancient radiator in the corner. The sharp smell of hot ink from the overworked laser printer mingled with the stale odor of yesterday's takeout and the musty scent of old paper, creating a dense, suffocating atmosphere. Daniel stood over the desk, his dress shirt wrinkled, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He pushed his thick-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose with his middle finger, a gesture of sheer exhaustion. It had been 48 hours since I handed him the routing numbers. I sat in the worn leather armchair, gripping the rough texture of the armrests. The rain outside lashed against the single grime-covered window, a steady, rhythmic assault that matched the frantic pounding in my chest. "Explain it to me," I managed to whisper, my throat dry and aching. I did not want comfort. I wanted the precise geometry of the betrayal. Daniel pulled the top ledger toward him, flipping the heavy paper pages with quick surgical precision. "We subpoenaed the Vanguard subsidiary records using the Cayman routing numbers you provided." He did not just hide bonuses, Sarah. He systematically drained the equity from your shared properties. He slid a glossy printed spreadsheet across the desk. I stared at the columns of numbers, the black ink stark against the bright white paper. My eyes tracked the dates. "The Lake Washington house," Daniel continued, his tone low and measured. "He took out a secondary mortgage 6 years ago. He funneled the cash through 3 shell companies, eventually landing in a trust controlled by Eleanor. He did the same with the commercial real estate portfolio in Portland. He bled the assets dry, leveraged them to the hilt, and parked the capital in untouchable family trusts." I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the sharp, grounding physical ache. The freezing terror I had carried for the past week returned, a cold, damp chill creeping into my bones. He had not just panicked and kicked me out, he had engineered a 14-year grift. The life I had built, the dinners I had hosted, the quiet compromises I had made, it was all a carefully constructed theater designed to keep me distracted while he robbed me blind. "He left me the debt," I said, the bitter taste of the truth coating my tongue. Daniel nodded, the warm light from the desk lamp casting long, dark shadows across his face. "When the dust settles on the divorce, the court will split the marital assets, but the assets you hold jointly are drowning in leveraged debt. The $30,000 he left you in checking. That was not a severance package, that was bait. He wanted you to hire a cheap lawyer, discover the massive liabilities, and panic. He wants you to settle for pennies just to avoid bankruptcy." The sheer scale of the fraud struck me like a physical blow. A heavy, unbearable weight settled in my stomach. The man I had married had vanished, replaced by a sociopathic architect who viewed my loyalty as an exploitable resource. The humiliation burned hot in my cheeks, a searing color rising to my skin. I had been the perfect compliant wife, polishing the silver while he pawned the house. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "How much did he steal?" Daniel closed the ledger. He looked at me, his eyes devoid of the impatient energy he usually carried. He watched me the way a coroner examines a fresh body. 4.2 million, and because the trusts were established before you filed for divorce, piercing them will require a federal fraud investigation. We have the routing numbers, but Vanguard's legal team will bury us in injunctions. They operate like a machine, Sarah. They will drag this out until your funds dry up. I looked down at the smooth surface of the wooden desk. The silence in the room stretched, tense and brittle. The grief was gone. The hollow, desperate ache of a broken marriage evaporated, burned away by the sheer magnitude of the theft. In its place, a cold, clinical fury took root. It was an icy, unyielding rage that froze the tears before they could form. I was no longer a discarded wife mourning a lost husband. I was a creditor, and Richard Mitchell was a thief. "He made a mistake," I said, the words slipping out with a quiet, deadly calm. Daniel paused, his hand hovering over the stack of files. "What?" "The Vanguard subsidiary," I continued, lifting my head to stare directly into Daniel's eyes. "He entertains the SEC regulators at the house every December." Emotion. He uses the catering budget from the Vanguard main account to cover the expenses, but he bills the vintage wine to the Caymans to avoid the strict compliance limits on corporate gifting. I have proof of this because I handled the invoices. I reconciled the discrepancies. Daniel's posture shifted. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sudden feral intensity. You have the invoices? I kept copies, I replied, the bitter flavor in my mouth replaced by a sharp metallic tang. I kept copies of every receipt, every catering bill, every wine order for the past 10 years. He assumed I was just being obsessive about the household budget. He believed I was organizing my little domestic kingdom. I unclasped my purse and pulled out a small, blue flash drive, placing it gently on the desk between us. The plastic casing caught the light, a tiny, innocuous object holding the power of a bomb. He did not just commit marital fraud, I said, the rhythmic clatter of the rain fading into the background. He violated federal compliance regulations using Vanguard's primary accounts. If we give this to the SEC, they will not just freeze his personal assets, they will gut the entire firm. Daniel stared at the flash drive, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He pushed his glasses up his nose, his eyes locking onto mine with an unspoken promise of absolute destruction. I watched him reach for the drive. I did not flinch. The heavy burden of being the good wife had been lifted, leaving an agonizing void that I was rapidly filling with a pure, undeniable truth. Richard had built his empire on my silence, but what happens when the silent partner finally decides to speak? Emotion. Dad said you were staying at a spa in Sedona, Ryan stated, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He said you needed time to process the separation. He sat across from me in a cheap vinyl booth at a 24-hour diner off Interstate 5. The sharp smell of stale coffee and burnt frying oil mingled with the metallic odor of the rain-soaked highway and the faint scent of lemon disinfectant. The harsh neon sign outside the window bathed the cracked leather seats in a deep, bloody color. I watched Ryan, at 22, wearing the tailored charcoal suit his father had bought him for his promotion at Vanguard. He held his chin high, adopting the precise defensive posture Richard used during hostile board meetings. Next to him, 19-year-old Emma sat in silence. She wore an oversized wool sweater, her pale hands actively twisting the black nylon strap of her backpack into a tight knot. It was a childhood habit she had never outgrown. I am not in Sedona, I said, my voice maintaining a low, steady hum. I heard the sharp clatter of silverware from the kitchen, a chaotic sound that mirrored my internal state. I am staying in Grace's guest room. The locks on the house were changed last Tuesday. Ryan shifted, his grip tightening on his biceps. Mom, you left. Dad showed me the email you sent. You said you wanted to pursue a different life. The bitter taste of the lie coated the back of my throat. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the sharp physical ache to maintain my composure. Richard had orchestrated a masterpiece. He had not just stolen the assets. He had stolen the narrative. The sheer weight of the betrayal threatened to crush me, but the sight of my children, confused, defensive, trapped in their father's web, forged a cold armor around my heart. I did not write an email, Ryan, I replied, tracing the rough texture of the paper napkin on the table. Your father drained the joint accounts. He engineered a massive fraud using the Vanguard subsidiary, transferred the equity of the house into an offshore trust, and evicted me. He left me with $30,000 and a single suitcase. Stop, Emma whispered. The bright, quick tone she usually carried was gone, replaced by a fragile, terrifying tremor. She looked down at the smooth surface of the formica table, her fingers twisting the nylon straps so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mama, please, just stop. He wouldn't do that, Ryan argued, leaning forward, the bravado slipping from his voice. Ma, Vanguard is audited twice a year. He is the senior partner. He operates like a machine. If he transferred that kind of capital, the compliance team would have flagged it. He billed the Caymans through the holiday catering budget, I said, the words cutting through the heavy silence of the booth. I handled the invoices. I reconciled the discrepancies. I have the ledgers, Ryan. Ryan stared at me. The dark shadow of doubt finally crossed his features. He worshipped his father the way young men worship the version of manhood they are too afraid to question. He had joined Vanguard straight out of college, eager to please. The dawning horror of what Richard had done was not just an attack on his family, it was an attack on his entire worldview. "You're lying," Ryan said. But the assertion lacked force. He sounded like a little boy lost in the dark. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thin manila folder. I placed it on the damp, sticky table and slid it across. "These are the secondary mortgage documents for the house. The signature on the bottom is mine, but I did not sign a mortgage. I signed what he told me were standard tax amendments for a revocable trust." Emma reached out, her trembling hand brushing the rough paper. She did not open the folder. The profound heartbreak in her eyes mirrored my own hidden grief. She sensed the reality long before the ink proved it. She was the emotional fulcrum of our family, the one who bore the brunt of the silent wars fought across the dinner table. When the truth finally surfaced, her reaction was not anger. It was a devastating, hollow despair. "Why?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. "Why would he do this to us?" "Because he views loyalty as a liability," I answered, the bitter flavor of the words matching the stale coffee in my mug. "He believes that if he controls the resources, he controls the people. He did not just betray me, Emma. He made your brother an accessory." Ryan flinched as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He stared at the folder, his arms uncrossing, falling limp to his sides. "I processed the Cayman vendor payments last December. He handed me the file. He said it was a routine holiday expense." The admission hung in the cold air, a suffocating burden that suddenly shifted from my shoulders to his. Richard had not just used me as a shield, he had used his own son as a mule. Emotion, the icy fury that had consumed me in Daniel Park's office, hardened into something deeper, something far more dangerous. It was a fierce maternal rage. I was no longer fighting just to reclaim my stolen life. I was fighting to sever my children from a toxic architect who would gladly burn them for an extra margin of profit. I reached across the table, my warm hand covering Emma's cold, trembling fingers. I looked at Ryan, meeting his horrified gaze with an unwavering resolve. "We are not going back to the way things were," I said. "I am going to dismantle his empire. I am going to take everything he stole. But I need to know, right now, whose side you are on." The clatter of the diner faded away. The neon light buzzed outside. My two children stared at me, the comfortable illusion of their upbringing shattered. They sat in the wreckage of Richard's lies, staring at the terrifying truth. If the perfect father was a monster, what was the mother willing to do to save them? Amosin, 14 years of perfect ledgers. I whispered to the empty room, my voice a low, steady hum over the clatter of the rain against the glass. And not a single mathematical anomaly until today. I sat alone at Grace's massive dining table, the smooth, cold surface hidden beneath a sprawling map of financial records. The sharp smell of old ink and printer toner mingled with the faint scent of my bitter black coffee. The dark shadows of the Seattle night pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the warm yellow light of the chandelier illuminated the physical evidence of Richard's deception. For 2 decades, I had smoothed every wrinkle in my family's life. I had organized the galas, balanced the household budget, and curated the perfect domestic facade. My own ambitions, the brilliant accounting mind I had possessed before Richard convinced me that my true calling was being his anchor, had calcified. I had spent years functioning as an invisible asset, my intellect buried beneath a mountain of social obligations. The betrayal had initially left me paralyzed by a suffocating weight of grief and despair, but the hollow ache of the discarded wife was rapidly fading. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, welcoming the sharp physical ache to ground my racing pulse. I did not want comfort. I wanted the precise geometry of his ruin. I reached for a thick blue folder containing the Vanguard catering receipts. The rough texture of the heavy paper chafed against my skin. Daniel Park had warned me that Vanguard's legal team would bury us in injunctions, dragging the process out until my meager resources vanished. The 30,000 Richard had left me was bait, a calculated insult designed to force a cheap settlement. But Richard had underestimated the very skill set he had exploited. He had treated my silence as a weakness, forgetting that a silent partner hears everything. I heard the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a steady rhythm that anchored my focus. I picked up a red pen and stared at the long columns of black ink. My eyes tracked the vendor payments, the dates, and the invoice numbers. December 12th, I muttered, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the apartment. Catering budget for the annual SEC holiday dinner. Billed to the primary account. I flipped open a secondary ledger, cross-referencing the offshore transfers. The bitter flavor of the coffee washed over my tongue as I dragged my finger down the page. There it was, a transfer of $9,900, exactly $100 below the federal flagging threshold. The date, December 14th, 2 days after the dinner. The memo line read, "Vintage procurement." A thrilling surge of competence electrified my spine, the freezing terror that had gripped me when I dragged my single suitcase into Grace's apartment evaporated. In its place, an icy clinical fury took root. The rust was falling off my mind, the intricate architecture of high-level forensic accounting reassembling itself piece by piece. I watched the numbers align on the page, the patterns emerging as if illuminated by a spotlight. The digits spoke to me the way a master musician reads sheet music. It was a language Richard assumed I had forgotten. He had structured the offshore transfers to avoid triggering an internal audit, using the cover of the catering budget to funnel Vanguard assets into the Caymans. He had done it every December for the past 10 years. He had used my son to process the paperwork. The sheer arrogance of it struck me like a physical blow. He believed he was an untouchable architect, operating a flawless machine. But a machine is only as strong as its weakest gear, and Richard's weakest gear was his sheer certainty that I would never check his math. I grabbed a yellow legal pad and began to map the flow of capital. The sound of my pen scratching against the paper echoed in the empty room. I charted the primary deposits, the secondary shell companies, and the final Cayman destinations. I isolated the exact dates of Eleanor's proxy signatures, proving the complicity of the family trust. I was no longer the compliant hostess. I was an auditor, and Richard Mitchell's ledger was bleeding red. The sheer magnitude of the fraud was breathtaking. It was a massive systemic violation of federal compliance regulations. The heavy burden of the past 14 years lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a raw, burning energy. The humiliation that had burned my cheeks was gone. The agonizing heartbreak of a ruined marriage vanished. This was no longer about a divorce. This was a hostile takeover. I worked through the night, the rhythmic clatter of the rain a constant companion. By the time the dark sky outside began to shift to a pale, bruised color, the legal pad was filled with precise, undeniable calculations. I had the dates, I had the amounts, I had the undeniable proof of structuring. Emotion. I stared at the intricate web I had drawn. The brilliant, capable woman I used to be was not dead. She had merely been sleeping, lulled into a coma by the comfortable illusion of a perfect life. Now she was wide awake, and she held a weapon far more dangerous than a subpoena. I picked up the blue flash drive, my grip tight around the hard plastic casing. The damp chill of the morning air crept into the apartment, but my blood was scorching hot. Daniel had said we could use this to hold a gun to Vanguard's head. He had said we could force a settlement. I looked at the mountain of evidence, my eyes tracing the exact coordinates of Richard's fatal arrogance. I didn't just want a settlement. I didn't just want the house or the offshore accounts. The silent wife had spent 2 decades protecting his empire from the shadows, but what happens when she finally brings the truth into the light? It wasn't Richard, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the law office as I pointed to the jagged cursive on the Cayman Trust documents. It was Eleanor. I sat across from Daniel Park, the smooth, cold surface of his mahogany desk buried beneath the files I had assembled at Grace's apartment. The sharp smell of stale ramen and ink dominated the small room, masking the faint odor of rain and the scent of old paper that clung to my wool coat. Daniel stood leaning over the desk, his dress shirt wrinkled. He pushed his thick-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose with his middle finger, a habitual gesture he repeated 3 times as he stared at the financial maps I had drawn. "Explain," Daniel demanded, his tone fast and precise, stripped of any comforting bedside manner. I watched the frantic energy radiating from him. He examined the ledgers the way a predator studies a blood trail. "Richard is arrogant, but he is not meticulous," I said, tracing the rough texture of the secondary mortgage document. "He leaves a messy wake. He forgets details. But this structure, the dummy accounts, the precise transfers exactly $100 below the federal flagging threshold, the integration with Vanguard's catering budget, it is too disciplined." I slid a printed email across the desk. The dark black ink created a stark color contrast against the bright white paper. "This is a proxy directive from 3 years ago. Eleanor Mitchell authorized the transfer of the Lake Washington equity into the family trust. Look at the date." Daniel leaned in, the warm yellow light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across his face. He read the document, his jaw tightening as if bracing for a physical blow. "December 16th, 2 days after the Vanguard holiday dinner." "Exactly," I managed to whisper, the sound barely audible over the low hum of the traffic outside the single, grime-covered window. "Eleanor controls the primary Mitchell family trust. Richard cannot move large sums of capital without her secondary authorization. He did not engineer this eviction alone. She built the cage, and she handed him the lock." The sheer weight of the betrayal threatened to crush the breath out of my lungs, but the icy, clinical fury I had cultivated over the past 2 days held me steady. The freezing despair of a discarded wife was dead, replaced by a steely clarity. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, welcoming the sharp physical ache. It anchored me to the present. "For 14 years, I continued, the bitter taste of the truth coating my tongue. Eleanor criticized my cooking. She complained about the drapery. She made a show of gifting me antique silver that required hours of polishing. I assumed she was just an overbearing mother-in-law clinging to her son. But it was a distraction. She kept you busy polishing silver while she quietly transferred the house you lived in," Daniel said, the rhythmic clatter of his pen tapping against the desk echoing in the quiet room. I heard the terrible finality in his words, the agonizing heartbreak of my ruined marriage hardening into a weapon. My entire life, the galas, the perfect dinners, the quiet compromises, had been a carefully constructed theater designed to extract my labor while stripping me of my equity. It was a financial trap set by the very woman who smiled at me across the Thanksgiving table. "She is the architect," I said, the words slipping out with a deadly quiet force. "Richard is just the blunt instrument she used to execute the fraud. If we target him, Vanguard will bury us in injunctions. They operate like a machine. But if we target Eleanor..." Daniel stopped tapping his pen. His eyes widened slightly as the legal implications clicked into place. The exhaustion vanished from his posture. "If we target Eleanor, we bypass Vanguard altogether. We subpoena the Mitchell Family Trust directly. We allege a multi-year conspiracy to defraud a spouse, with documentary evidence tying the matriarch to the Cayman accounts." "Can we do it?" I asked, gripping the arms of the leather chair. "We do not even need to win the case immediately," Daniel said, a slow, feral smile spreading across his face. "The moment we file the subpoena against Eleanor Mitchell, the court freezes the family trust to preserve the assets. The trust that Richard currently relies on to fund his lifestyle. We cut off his primary supply line. We choke him out. The heavy burden of the past 2 decades lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a raw, burning thrill, a flavor far sharper than grief. I had spent years functioning as an invisible asset, my brilliant accounting mind buried beneath a mountain of social obligations. Eleanor had counted on my silence. She had treated my loyalty as a vulnerability to be exploited. We file it, I instructed, my voice unwavering. I want the subpoena drafted by tomorrow morning. Emotion I once Owenorg. I want Eleanor's accounts frozen before she finishes her morning tea. Daniel reached for a yellow legal pad, his pen flying across the page. She will not go down quietly, Sarah. She has the resources to drag this out. She will attempt to destroy your reputation. Let her, I replied, the damp chill of the Seattle afternoon fading against the scorching heat in my blood. I was no longer the compliant wife. I was a hostile creditor, and the Mitchell family ledger was bleeding red. I looked down at the sprawling map of Vanguard receipts and offshore routing numbers, the undeniable proof of a 14-year lie. The perfect family was nothing but a hollow shell designed to hide a massive, systemic theft. But as I stared at the precise, jagged signature of my mother-in-law, I faced the terrifying truth. If Eleanor had set the trap, what other bodies were buried in the family secret? Emotion. He changed the electronic locks, Grace said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper over the low hum of the engine. Are you certain the old service door still works? Grace had killed the headlights of her Range Rover half a block away from the gated driveway of the Lake Washington estate. The dark shadows of the sprawling house cut a jagged shape against the overcast Seattle sky. The scent of pine needles and damp earth drifted through the cracked car window, masking the faint odor of exhaust. Grace gripped the steering wheel, pointing her entire hand toward the wrought iron gate. The service door runs on a separate mechanical deadbolt, I replied, tracing the rough texture of the brass key in my pocket. Richard never used it. He probably forgot it even exists. And if Eleanor is awake, Grace pressed, her blunt, unapologetic tone forcing me to confront the reality of my actions. She did not coddle me. She had survived her own brutal divorce 6 years ago and rebuilt from the wreckage. I handled Eleanor for 14 years, I said, the bitter flavor of the memory coating my tongue. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the sharp physical ache to steady my racing pulse. I can handle her tonight. I slipped out of the car. The cold night air hit my face like a physical blow. The freezing terror that had paralyzed me earlier in the week returned, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I was breaking into my own home. I was a trespasser in the life I had curated. I moved quietly along the perimeter wall, avoiding the motion sensor lights. The damp grass soaked the bottom of my jeans. I reached the wooden service door near the kitchen pantry. My hands shook as I inserted the brass key into the lock. I heard the metal mechanism engage with a loud metallic clatter that echoed in the heavy silence. I pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a faint creak. I stepped into the dark kitchen. The smooth, polished marble countertops reflected the pale moonlight. The familiar smell of lemon polish and expensive coffee beans assaulted my senses, a sharp reminder of the domestic cage I had inhabited. I crept down the hallway toward Richard's home office. My heart pounded an erratic rhythm against my ribs. The agonizing heartbreak of the betrayal had faded, replaced by an icy adrenaline-fueled focus. I reached the heavy oak door of the office. It was unlocked. Richard always locked it when he was home, but he was away in Tokyo for a Vanguard conference. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me. I did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I clicked on the small, warm reading lamp on his desk. The glow illuminated the sterile, pristine environment. I stared at the massive mahogany desk, exactly where he always kept the physical ledger for his secondary shell accounts. I pulled open the bottom drawer. It was locked. I dropped to my knees, running my fingers under the heavy wooden rim of the desk. My hand brushed against the rough edge of a taped key. I pulled it free, a fierce surge of exhilaration rising in my chest. The terrified, compliant wife was dead. In her place was an intruder executing a flawless heist. I inserted the key, the drawer unlocked. I pulled it open and reached inside, my fingers wrapping around a thick, leather-bound ledger. The physical weight of the book was staggering. It held the exact coordinates of a multi-million-dollar fraud. You always were too quiet, Sarah. The voice sliced through the silence. I gasped, dropping the ledger onto the carpet. Eleanor Mitchell sat in a high-backed leather wing chair in the dark corner of the office, her hands clasped serenely in her lap. She wore a floral silk robe, her posture rigid and victorious. The dim light cast a sickly yellow color over her pale skin. She looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of my marriage. Eleanor, I managed to whisper, my throat tight and dry. The sheer terror of being caught froze my muscles. Richard warned me you might try something foolish, she said, her tone soft and grandmotherly yet devoid of any genuine warmth. He changed the electronic codes. He canceled the credit cards. He assumed you would simply fade away, the way a sensible woman should. I am not fading, I said, the words slipping out with a desperate defiance. I watched Eleanor stand up slowly, her frail appearance masking a core of absolute iron. She stepped into the warm glow of the lamp, her eyes locking onto mine. You are trespassing. If I call the police, you will be arrested. You will lose any chance of seeing Ryan or Emma again. The threat hung in the air, a suffocating burden designed to break me. For 2 decades, I had surrendered to her demands. I had swallowed the humiliation. I had endured the silent judgment. But as I stared at the woman who had engineered my financial ruin, the terrified panic inside me suddenly evaporated. Emotion, in its place, a brilliant, scorching triumph ignited my blood. She was standing here in the dark because she was terrified. She was guarding the ledger because it held the proof of her complicity. I reached down and picked up the heavy leather book, my grip tightening around the spine. Call them, I challenged, my voice ringing clear and steady in the quiet room. Eleanor's serene expression faltered. A flicker of genuine shock crossed her features. Call the police, Eleanor, I repeated, stepping toward her. Tell them your daughter-in-law broke into the house. Tell them she stole the master ledger for the Cayman accounts. Tell them she is taking it directly to the SEC to expose the Mitchell family trust. Eleanor stared at me, her hands trembling slightly. The balance of power shifted, a violent, invisible earthquake shattering the foundation of her control. She was no longer the untouchable matriarch, and I was no longer the obedient shadow. I walked past her, the bitter taste of fear replaced by the sweet flavor of victory. I pushed the heavy oak door open, leaving her standing in the wreckage of her own arrogance. I walked down the long hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the marble floor, carrying the single piece of evidence that would bring down an empire. I slipped out the service door and ran through the damp grass toward Grace's waiting car. The dark silhouette of the Range Rover offered sanctuary. I pulled the passenger door open and climbed inside, breathless and burning with an impossible triumph. Grace looked at the leather ledger in my hands. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't offer pity. Did you get it? I got it, I answered, staring at the embossed cover of the book. The heist was complete, but what terrifying truth was waiting inside the master ledger? It's not just a divorce settlement anymore, Daniel said, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose with his middle finger as he stared at the staggering numbers. This is a federal indictment. The heavy leather cover of the master ledger had hit Daniel's mahogany desk with a dull, satisfying clatter an hour earlier. We sat in the claustrophobic confines of his office, the dark shadows of the early morning Seattle sky pressing against the single window. The sterile, fluorescent overhead bulbs cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the pages. The sharp smell of old paper and the scent of stale coffee dominated the small room, masking the faint odor of damp wool from my coat. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the sharp physical ache to anchor my racing pulse. The freezing terror of the break-in had vanished, replaced by an electric current of profound vindication. For months, Richard had gaslit me into questioning my own sanity. He had dismissed my questions about the Vanguard accounts as the hysterical ravings of a stressed wife. He had treated my intellect like a fragile, broken toy. But I was not crazy. Look at the routing sequence, I said, my voice steady over the low hum of the office ventilation system. I dragged my finger across the smooth texture of the ledger paper. The dark blue ink formed a precise, undeniable map. He didn't just siphon capital from the joint accounts. He diverted Vanguard's raw asset funds directly into a Cayman holding shell before the quarterly earnings were even reported. Daniel leaned closer, the color draining from his face as he examined the handwritten entries. He read the numbers the way a coroner examines a fatal wound. This is a massive violation of SEC regulations. He is cooking the books on a corporate level. He used the catering budget as a smokescreen for the initial transfers, I explained, the bitter flavor of the betrayal finally losing its power to paralyze me. But the bulk of the capital moved through Eleanor's secondary trust. She signed the proxy directives. He moved the money, and they used my son's signature as the final authorizing stamp on the compliance forms. Daniel took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I heard the rhythmic sound of his breathing fill the heavy silence of the room. He picked up a pen, his grip tight around the plastic casing. We have the dates, we have the amounts, we have the routing numbers. The paper trail is flawless. It is a flawless machine, I replied in a quiet whisper, staring at the columns of numbers. But every machine leaves a signature. The suffocating weight of my ruined marriage lifted from my shoulders, shattering the hollow despair that had choked me since the eviction. My brilliant accounting mind, buried beneath 2 decades of social obligations and perfectly curated galas, was fully awake. The humiliation of being the discarded wife was gone. The agonizing heartbreak of a stolen life hardened into an icy fury. The heavy burden of grief evaporated. I was armed with the undeniable truth, a weapon far sharper than any subpoena. I flipped to the final section of the ledger, my hands moving with a clinical, forensic precision. The rough edge of the paper chafed against my skin. There is something else, I said, my eyes tracking a repetitive anomaly in the December entries. The Cayman transfers are not random. They correspond exactly with the dates of Vanguard's annual aggressive expansion acquisitions. He was front-running his own company's stock, Daniel breathed, the exhaustion vanishing from his posture. He used the embezzled funds to buy shares through the shell accounts right before Vanguard announced the acquisitions, artificially inflating his own net worth while shielding the assets from the divorce. It's insider trading, I confirmed, the sweet taste of victory replacing the metallic fear in my mouth. Sarah, Daniel said, his tone dropping the fast, impatient edge he usually carried. I watched the gravity of the situation settle over his features. With this ledger, we don't just win the divorce, we destroy him. We destroy Eleanor. We dismantle the entire Mitchell family empire. The SEC will freeze every asset they possess within 24 hours of receiving this document. He was a bulldog who had spent his career fighting unwinnable battles against corrupt financial architectures, fueled by the memory of his own mother's bankruptcy. Now, I had just handed him the nuclear code. The warm air in the office hung thick, charged with the undeniable gravity of our next move. Richard had built a fortress of lies, assuming my compliance was a permanent condition. He had treated my loyalty as a vulnerability. He had assumed the woman who balances the books would never bite back. Draft the SEC whistleblower complaint, I instructed, the cold, steely clarity of my anger cementing into a permanent foundation. A motion, I want it filed simultaneously with the divorce countersuit. Vanguard's legal team will attempt to bury you, Daniel warned, though a slow, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. They will attack your credibility. They will say you stole the ledger to extort a settlement. Let them, I replied, standing up from the heavy leather chair. They can call me a thief, they can call me a bitter, discarded wife, but they cannot argue with the math. I looked down at the open ledger, the physical embodiment of my stolen years, my destroyed family, and my shattered illusions. The terrifying heist had yielded the ultimate prize, but as I cast a final glance at the last entry on the page, a new threat emerged. If Richard was willing to commit federal fraud to protect his wealth, what would he do when he discovered the master ledger was missing? A very cont et sleutnhas, but that's your dunary. You have always been prone to dramatics, Sarah. Richard's warm baritone echoed through the small, nearly empty cafe, dripping with a patronizing patience. But breaking into your mother-in-law's house crosses a line. Richard sat across from me at a small corner table. The dark shadows of the stormy Seattle morning pressed against the rain-streaked windows, casting a dull, grayish color over the room. The sharp smell of roasted coffee beans and the damp odor of wet wool filled the air. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking as though he had just stepped out of a Vanguard boardroom rather than a red-eye flight from Tokyo. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the familiar physical ache to anchor my racing pulse. The triumphant high of the heist had vanished. I was back in the presence of the architect, and the sheer weight of his proximity threatened to crush the breath out of my lungs. I took what belonged to me, I said, keeping my voice low and steady to mask the trembling in my hands. The smooth texture of the wooden table offered no comfort. I took the master ledger, Richard. I have the Vanguard routing numbers. I have Eleanor's proxy signatures. Richard straightened his left cufflink, the gold catching the pale light. It was a tell I had seen 1,000 times over our 14-year marriage, a physical reset before he delivered a calculated blow. He did not look angry. He did not look like a cornered animal. He examined me the way a mathematician examines a flawed equation. You have a stolen book filled with outdated tax estimates, he replied, signaling the waitress for the check. And you have a second-rate lawyer who is about to lose his license for advising his client to commit burglary. It's not outdated, I shot back, the bitter taste of fear coating my mouth. It shows a decade of structuring. It shows you front-running Vanguard's acquisitions. He leaned forward, the faint scent of his expensive cologne reaching across the table. Do you really believe I would leave the actual master ledger in an unlocked desk drawer in a house my mother occupies? The words hit me like a physical blow. I heard the rhythmic clatter of cups behind the counter fade into a ringing silence. The book you stole is a decoy, Richard continued, his tone clipped and dismissive. I created it 3 years ago when Vanguard ran an internal security audit. It contains just enough real data to look authentic, but every offshore account listed in that book was closed in 2023. If you hand that to the SEC, they will laugh at you, and then Vanguard's legal team will bury you for corporate espionage. A cold, suffocating despair gripped my chest, extinguishing the fragile spark of hope I had harbored. The freezing terror returned, heavy and absolute. I stared at him, searching for the micro-expression of a lie, but his face was an impenetrable mask. He was telling the truth. You set a trap, I managed to say in a harsh whisper, the sound barely audible over the hum of the espresso machine. I secured my assets, Richard corrected smoothly. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the rough surface of the table. This is an emergency injunction filed this morning. It freezes the remaining $30,000 in your temporary account, pending an investigation into the break-in at the estate. I cast a glance at the legal document. The stark black ink, blurred as tears of raw humiliation, burned the corners of my eyes. He had not just outmaneuvered me. He had cut off my final lifeline. I had nothing. I was living on Grace's couch, and the weapon I believed I possessed was nothing but a prop. Emma's tuition is due next week, I said, the agonizing heartbreak of the situation fracturing my composure. Ryan needs his rent money for his internship. They are my children, Richard said, his voice hardening into a possessive growl. I will handle their finances. You will no longer use them as a shield to extract a settlement. He stood up, buttoning his jacket with a steady, practiced grip. The heavy burden of his power pressed down on me, a crushing force designed to force my surrender. He did not hate me. He just needed to neutralize a liability, executing the maneuver with a cold arithmetic that fueled my silent fury. Daniel Park cannot save you, Sarah, Richard said, looking down at me with genuine pity. You have no money. You have no leverage. You have until Friday to sign the original settlement offer. If you refuse, I will press charges for the break-in, and you will spend the next 5 years fighting Vanguard from a jail cell. I watched him walk out of the cafe, his confident stride cutting through the damp morning air. The hollow grief of the discarded wife rushed back in, tearing down the steely clarity I had fought so hard to build. Emotion. I sat alone at the table, the freezing chill of the Seattle storm seeping into my bones. I traced my finger over the injunction, the bitter flavor of absolute defeat flooding my senses. Richard was an untouchable machine, and I was just collateral damage. The sheer desperation of the moment was suffocating, forcing me to ask the one question I had tried to avoid. If the ledger was a fake, what was the truth about my missing 14 years? Emotion. It's a beautiful piece, Mrs. Mitchell, the appraiser said, his voice lowering into a practiced display of sympathy. Are you certain you want to liquidate it? I sat in the sterile, brightly lit office of a downtown Seattle diamond exchange. The dark shadow of a security guard hovered near the entrance. The sharp scent of glass cleaner and the faint odor of old leather filled the small room. Across the desk, the appraiser, a thin man with a graying beard, held my 3-carat platinum wedding ring under a blinding halogen light. The stone caught the glare, fracturing it into a brilliant color spectrum that danced across the white walls. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the familiar physical ache to anchor my racing pulse. Richard had presented this ring to me 14 years ago in Paris. It was supposed to be a symbol of our enduring partnership. Instead, it had been the first heavy chain in a golden cage, a physical marker of my subjugation. I am sure, I replied in a quiet whisper, my tone flat and stripped of any lingering sentiment. The freezing terror of Richard's injunction had burned away, leaving a strange, hollow space in my chest. Just give me the valuation. I can offer you $45,000, he said, placing the ring on the smooth texture of the velvet display pad. The market for high-clarity diamonds is currently soft. I cannot go any higher. $45,000. It was less than half of what Richard had claimed he paid for it. The bitter flavor of yet another betrayal coated my tongue, but the agonizing heartbreak that had paralyzed me just hours ago was gone. Richard had frozen the $30,000 in my bank account, cutting off my final lifeline to force a surrender. He expected me to crawl back, broken and destitute. He expected the quiet, compliant wife to fold under the crushing weight of his financial power, but as I stared at the glittering stone, the suffocating burden of the past 2 decades finally evaporated. I reached out and touched the cold metal of the band one last time. Write the check, I instructed, the sound of my own voice ringing with a new steely authority. The appraiser nodded, opening his desk drawer with a faint creak. I watched him fill out the paperwork, the rhythmic clatter of his pen striking the paper echoing in the heavy silence. The transaction was swift, clinical, and devoid of any messy emotion. I was trading the ultimate symbol of my marriage for the capital required to dismantle it. I took the cashier's check, sliding it into the rough fabric of my wool coat. I walked out of the exchange and into the damp Seattle afternoon. I heard the heavy security door lock behind me. The cold rain hit my face like a sudden slap, washing away the lingering smell of the jeweler's office. I pulled out my phone and dialed Daniel Park. Sarah, Daniel answered on the second ring, the low hum of traffic bleeding through the receiver. I was just about to call you, the injunction Richard filed. I know about the injunction, I interrupted, walking toward Grace's parked car. He froze the accounts. He thinks he has starved us out. He has, Daniel said, his usual rapid-fire delivery slowing into a cautious drawl. We cannot fund a forensic investigation into his shell companies without a retainer, Sarah. Vanguard will bury us in motions. Without capital, we cannot fight a war of attrition. I just wired $45,000 to your firm's trust account, I said, opening the heavy car door and slipping into the driver's seat. A stunned silence stretched across the line. Where did you get $45,000? Daniel finally asked, his tone shifting from pity to genuine shock. I sold my wedding ring, I replied, gripping the steering wheel. The leather was warm against my cold palms. The symbol of my loyalty is now funding my retaliation. Use the money, Daniel. Hire the forensic accountants. Dig into the 2023 tax records Richard claimed were closed. We are going to find the real master ledger. Sarah, if we do this, there is no going back, Daniel warned. This is not just a divorce anymore. If we trace those funds and prove he committed federal fraud to hide his assets, the SEC will seize everything. You might recover nothing from the estate. I don't want the estate, I said, casting a brief glance at my bare ring finger. A liberating emptiness expanded in my chest. The paralyzing despair was dead, replaced by a cold, forensic fury. I was lighter. I was no longer weighed down by the need to preserve the illusion of a perfect family. I was shedding the humiliation of a good wife, and underneath it I was a weapon. I want him to watch his empire burn. Message received, Daniel said, the predatory edge returning to his voice. I will authorize the forensic team immediately. We will start with the Cayman transfers. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat.
Emotion.
I stared through the rain-streaked windshield, watching the blurry city lights begin to flicker on against the darkening sky. Richard believed he had neutralized me by taking my home, my security, and my pride. He had treated my silence like a weakness, assuming I would simply fade away the way a discarded asset should. I turned the ignition key, the engine roaring to life as if answering a call to battle. The raw grief had transformed into an untouchable, calculated focus. The war had officially begun. I had liquidated the past to finance the future, but as I pulled into the heavy traffic, a chilling question took hold. If the entire marriage was a financial trap, what terrifying secret was Richard hiding in the missing files? Emotion. Dad said you were having a breakdown, Mom, Ryan said, crossing his arms tightly across his chest in a defensive posture he had stolen directly from Richard. I stood in the center of Ryan's luxury downtown apartment, the one Richard had paid for as a graduation gift. The dark shadows of the late evening crept across the polished hardwood floors. A sleek, modern floor lamp cast a warm golden color against the stark white walls. The faint scent of expensive cologne and the sharp smell of citrus cleaning solution hung in the air, masking the stale odor of takeout food. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the familiar physical ache to ground my racing pulse. I was here to detonate a bomb in my son's life. The crushing weight of what I had to do threatened to shatter my resolve, but a fierce fury pushed the hesitation aside. Ryan was 22, brilliant but naive, worshiping the version of manhood his father had meticulously crafted. He was ignorant of the trap closing around him. I am not having a breakdown, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. The low hum of the city traffic outside offered a steady rhythm to the tense silence in the room. Richard is lying to you, Ryan. He is lying to everyone. Ryan let out a short, dismissive breath, looking away. He had the same arrogance set to his jaw as Richard, the same unyielding confidence. But I watched the subtle tension in his shoulders. Underneath the bravado, he was just a boy caught in the crossfire. I pulled the thick manila folder from my bag and dropped it onto the glass coffee table. The rhythmic clatter of the heavy paper striking the surface echoed sharply. Open it. He didn't move. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I said, open it, I repeated, my tone dropping the gentle cadence of a mother and adopting a cold, forensic precision. Ryan finally uncrossed his arms, leaning forward to flip the cover open. I heard the sharp rustle of paper as he sifted through the photocopies Daniel Park had secured. They were the preliminary findings from the forensic accountants, tracing the Cayman transfers back to Vanguard's core accounts. These are routing sequences for offshore shell companies, Ryan said, his brow furrowing as he dragged a finger over the rough texture of the printed spreadsheet. Vanguard doesn't use this holding structure. They do when the CEO is embezzling capital to front-run his own acquisitions, I explained, the bitter flavor of the betrayal rising in my throat. Your father has been cooking the books for 3 years, Ryan. He used the divorce as a smokescreen to bleed the joint accounts dry. No, Ryan shot back, standing up abruptly. His grip tightened on the edge of the glass table. Dad wouldn't do that. You're misinterpreting the data. You don't grasp how these corporate structures work. I stepped closer, ignoring the agonizing heartbreak of watching him defend a monster. Look at the authorization signatures on page 4. Ryan hesitated, then flipped to the fourth page. I stared at him, watching the exact moment the devastating truth finally pierced his armor. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, a silent gasp of pure horror. That's my signature, he whispered, the sound cracking under the strain. He touched the smooth paper as if it were burning his skin. I signed these as part of the quarterly compliance audits. Dad said they were just routine internal transfers for the European expansion. He made you an accomplice, I said, the raw grief giving way to an absolute need for the protection of my son, an act of fierce love. He used your compliance clearance to authorize the movement of stolen funds. If the SEC investigates Vanguard, Richard will claim he had no knowledge of the Cayman accounts. The paper trail leads directly to you. Ryan staggered back, hitting the edge of the leather sofa. The sheer humiliation and shame of the betrayal washed over him, physically collapsing his posture. He looked at me, his eyes wide and terrified, stripped of the corporate arrogance he had worn just moments before. He was looking at me the way a drowning man looks at a life raft. Why would he do this to me? Ryan asked, his voice trembling. I did everything he asked. I worked 80-hour weeks. I never questioned him, because to Richard, we are all just assets on a ledger, I replied, moving to his side and pulling him into a tight embrace. The damp sweat on his forehead pressed against my cheek. I held him fiercely, absorbing the violent tremors shaking his body. The guilt of shattering his illusion of his father was a heavy burden, but the suffocating despair was gone. I would not let Richard destroy my children. What do I do, Mom? He asked, clinging to my coat. If I go to the board, he'll destroy me. You do exactly what I tell you, I instructed, pulling back to look him directly in the eyes. You go to work tomorrow. You smile. Emotion. You agree with everything he says. And you quietly download the entirety of the 2023 encrypted email server onto a physical drive. He monitors the server traffic, Ryan warned, the cold panic still evident in his eyes. I know, I said, a dangerous, steely calm settling over me, which is why we are going to use Eleanor's master password to bypass the security protocols. Ryan stared at me, the terrifying reality of our rebellion finally taking hold. I was no longer the quiet, compliant mother who baked cookies and hosted galas. I was a strategist, and I was pulling him from the wreckage of Richard's empire. The battle lines were drawn. I had secured my most vital ally. But as I cast a final glance at the forged signature on the document, a chilling question emerged. If Richard was ruthless enough to frame his own son for federal fraud, what other horrifying secret was buried in the Vanguard vault? He didn't just hide the assets, Sarah, Daniel said, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose as he stared at the decryption screen. He built a secondary shadow corporation using Vanguard's infrastructure. I stood over the dining table in Grace's apartment, the command center for our rebellion. The dark shadows of midnight pressed against the living room windows, shielding us from the relentless Seattle storm. The warm golden color of the floor lamps contrasted with the sterile blue glow of 3 laptops. The sharp scent of freshly brewed espresso mingled with the damp odor of Ryan's wool coat, masking the faint smell of old paper rising from the printed dossiers. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the sharp physical ache to center my racing pulse. The numbness of the past weeks had vanished, replaced by a commanding solidarity. The heavy burden of fighting Richard alone was gone. I looked around the room, taking in the makeshift family that had gathered to dismantle a monster. Grace stood at the kitchen counter, pointing with her entire hand at a series of printouts. He funneled 12 million through the Cayman entity in February alone, she said, her voice loud and blunt, carrying the unyielding authority of a woman who had survived her own brutal divorce. If he files those fake tax returns on Friday, it's a federal offense. It's already a federal offense, Daniel replied, the fast, impatient edge of his tone softened by genuine awe. He rubbed the smooth texture of the external hard drive Ryan had smuggled out of the Vanguard server room. Ryan bypassed the two-factor authentication perfectly. We have the raw encrypted email logs. The paper trail is flawless. Ryan sat on the edge of the sofa, his arms crossed tightly over his chest in the defensive posture he had adopted from Richard. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes standing out against the pale pallor of his skin. The bitter flavor of betrayal still lingered in his expression, a painful reminder of the father he had lost. I used Eleanor's master password just like you told me, Mom, Ryan said, his voice dropping into a quiet, uncertain whisper. He looked at me, seeking reassurance. The IT department didn't flag the download because it registered as a scheduled archive backup. You did perfectly, I said, moving to the sofa and sitting beside him. I reached out and placed my hand over his tight grip, the cold chill of his knuckles warming under my touch. You protected yourself, Ryan. You broke the chain. He uncrossed his arms, leaning into my shoulder. The agonizing heartbreak of pulling my son into this war was a heavy weight, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, protective love. The hollow despair that had defined my marriage was replaced by a profound sense of belonging. Richard had offered false security, demanding silent compliance in exchange for a comfortable cage. But here, in the cramped confines of Grace's apartment, surrounded by a cynical lawyer, a fiercely loyal friend, and a courageous son, I found my true family. Okay, let's finalize the timeline, Daniel instructed, pacing across the rough rug. He sounded like a general preparing for a siege. We have the forensic accounting from the Cayman transfers funded by Sarah's ring. We have the decrypted internal emails proving Richard ordered the structuring. And we have the forged compliance documents bearing Ryan's signature. When do we file? Grace asked. I heard the rhythmic clatter of her coffee cup striking the saucer break the heavy silence. Friday morning, I said, standing up and approaching the table. I traced my finger over the printed injunction Richard had served me, the stark black ink a reminder of his arrogance. Richard expects me to sign the original settlement offer by noon on Friday. He believes I am broken, destitute, and desperate. He expects a surrender. Instead, he gets a federal indictment, Daniel said, a slow, predatory smile forming. I will file the whistleblower complaint directly with the SEC at 9 a.m. Simultaneously, I will serve Vanguard's board of directors with the full evidentiary dossier. The moment the board sees the liability, they will freeze Richard out to protect the firm. And the divorce countersuit, Grace asked, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. Failed at 9:05 a.m., Daniel confirmed, citing financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal endangerment of a dependent. I watched the three of them, Daniel meticulously organizing the files, Grace poring over the strategy, Ryan finally breathing without the crushing weight of Richard's expectations. I had spent 2 decades smoothing every wrinkle in the Mitchell family's life, calcifying my own ambitions to serve a man who viewed me as a depreciating asset. I was not that woman anymore. I had weaponized my silence, letting Richard underestimate me until he walked blindly into a trap of his own making. Emotion, the fury that burned in my chest was cold, forensic, and absolute. Print 3 copies of the master dossier, I instructed, my tone measured and clinical, one for the SEC, one for the board, and one for Eleanor. Ryan looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. Grandma? She was the architect of the secondary trust, I said, the metallic taste of absolute victory coating my tongue. She signed the proxy directives. I want her to know exactly who dismantled her empire. I picked up the final sheet of the decrypted emails, preparing to add it to the stack. But as I cast a glance at the recipient list on a heavily redacted message from 2018, the breath caught in my throat. The email wasn't sent to Eleanor or the Cayman Shell Company. It was sent to a private medical facility under Grace's name. The room tilted, the commanding solidarity fractured for a single terrifying second. If Richard had been monitoring Grace 6 years ago, what devastating secret was waiting in the missing medical files? You always were prone to exhaustion, dear, Eleanor said, her soft, grandmotherly tone slicing through the quiet room like a freshly sharpened scalpel. Perhaps missing the charity gala this year is for the best. I sat across from Eleanor in the immaculate drawing room of the Mitchell estate, the very same house I had broken into just days earlier. The dark shadows of the late afternoon stretched across the Persian rug. The warm color of the setting sun offered no comfort against the oppressive chill of the room. The sharp scent of Earl Grey tea and the cloying odor of Eleanor's expensive rose water filled the air, mingling with the faint smell of lemon polish on the antique wood. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the familiar physical ache to ground my performance. The paralyzing numbness of the past few weeks had vanished. The sheer weight of the betrayal had hardened into a cold, predatory satisfaction. I was here to secure my invitation to Friday's Vanguard Gala, the exact stage where Daniel and I planned to drop the federal indictment. But to get the invitation, I had to play the part of the broken, destitute wife. I don't want to miss it, I whispered, keeping my voice low and brittle, ensuring it trembled just enough. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and expectant. I picked up my teacup, deliberately loosening my grip so the fine porcelain rattled against the saucer with a sharp clatter. It's the only social event I have left, Eleanor. Richard froze my accounts. I have nothing. Eleanor clasped her frail, manicured hands in her lap, presenting the serene posture of a matriarch who believed she had already won the war. She looked at me the way a hawk examines a wounded field mouse, with detached, calculated pity. Richard is merely protecting the family assets, Eleanor replied, smoothing the rough texture of her tweed skirt. You must admit, your recent behavior has been erratic. The break-in, the demands. It lacks the dignity we expect from a Mitchell. The bitter flavor of her hypocrisy coated my tongue. She was the architect of the Cayman Trust. She had signed the proxy directives that drained my marriage of its financial foundation. And yet she sat there in her floral blouse, hiding her venom behind a veneer of maternal concern. The agonizing heartbreak I once harbored for this family was gone. A thrilling sense of duplicity rushed through me, mastering the art of playing the fool to catch the predator. I was desperate, I said, leaning forward and letting a look of hollow despair wash over my face. I touched the smooth, cold rim of my teacup. I just wanted to find something that proved he still cared. But the ledger, it was fake. He told me it was a decoy. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, a micro-expression of smug validation crossing her weathered features. She had orchestrated the decoy. She was fully aware of how effectively I had been outplayed. Richard is a very thorough man, Eleanor said smoothly, which is why attending the gala is unwise. The board will be there. The investors will be there. You are currently a liability, Sarah. It is better if you stay away. If I stay away, it proves the rumors, I countered, injecting a note of desperate, pleading hope into my tone. I heard the distant hum of the estate's HVAC system kicking on, a low drone beneath our verbal chess match. If I don't show up, everyone will assume Richard is discarding me because I had a breakdown. But if we arrive together, if we smile for the cameras, it projects stability. It protects the Vanguard stock price. I watched the argument land. Eleanor cared about nothing more than the pristine image of the Mitchell empire. The burden of public scandal was her absolute worst nightmare. If you attend, Eleanor said slowly, her voice taking on a hard, warning edge, you will stand by his side. You will not discuss the settlement. You will smile. You will wear the sapphire necklace, and you will be the perfect silent wife. I will, I promised, the words sliding off my tongue with effortless deception. I will be exactly what he needs me to be. Very well, Eleanor conceded, reaching for a small silver bell on the table to summon the maid. I will inform Richard that you will accompany him. But understand this, Sarah. If you embarrass my son, I will ensure you never see your children again. The blatant threat hung in the damp, heavy air of the drawing room. A sudden surge of dark, unyielding fury ignited in my chest, but I forced my expression to remain meek and defeated. I lowered my head, accepting her terms as though I were utterly broken. Thank you, Eleanor, I said quietly, standing up from the heavy velvet chair. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, my posture slumped, playing the role of the tragic victim perfectly. But as I crossed the threshold and stepped out of her line of sight, the facade dissolved. Emotion was a teeth, the flawless emotion. A fierce, predatory satisfaction flooded my veins. The trap was set. The invitation was secured. Richard and Eleanor believed they had successfully neutralized me, blissfully unaware that the woman they had invited to their grand celebration was carrying a federal indictment. The plan was flawless. The execution would be public and devastating, but as I cast a final glance back at the imposing facade of the Mitchell estate, the chilling question from the decrypted emails returned. What terrible secret was Grace hiding, and how would it alter the fallout of the gala? Ellen emotion was spalter the Polonors. Smile for the cameras, Sarah, Richard whispered, his warm baritone dripping with patronizing patience as he straightened his cufflinks. Let's show them we are still a team. I stood beside him in the grand foyer of the St. Regis, the epicenter of the Vanguard Gala. The dark shadows of the damp Seattle evening were pushed back by the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras. The warm golden color of the crystal chandeliers washed over the polished marble floors, illuminating the pinnacle of Seattle's corporate elite. The sharp scent of expensive champagne mingled with the cloying odor of heavy floral arrangements, masking the faint smell of wet wool from the arriving guests' coats. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the sharp physical ache to remind me of the stakes. But the paralyzing numbness that had defined my life for the past month was gone. The heavy burden of public opinion, the crushing weight of Richard's expectations, it all evaporated. As I looked around the room, taking in the calculating stares of the board members who had enabled Richard's betrayal, an intoxicating, absolute fearlessness washed over me. The societal judgment that once ruled my every decision now meant nothing. Richard offered me his arm, projecting the illusion of the perfect, powerful couple. I slipped my hand through the crook of his elbow, my fingers resting lightly against the smooth texture of his bespoke tuxedo. His grip was firm, almost bruising, a physical demand for compliance. "You look stunning, my wife," he said, the possessive edge in his tone unmistakable. He glanced at the heavy sapphire necklace resting against my collarbone, the very necklace Eleanor had demanded I wear as a symbol of my subservience. "Thank you, Richard," I replied, the sudden sound of my voice steady, carrying none of the hollow despair he expected. "I wouldn't miss tonight for the world." We walked into the main ballroom, and the crowd parted the way a school of fish scatters before a shark. The low hum of 100 simultaneous conversations dropped into a tense, expectant silence. I heard the faint clatter of a champagne flute being set down too quickly on a nearby table. Every eye was on me, the discarded wife who was supposed to be hiding in shame. Across the room, Eleanor sat at the central table, clasping her hands together in her lap with a serene smile. She looked frail and grandmotherly, her floral dress a perfect camouflage for the iron-willed matriarch beneath. She offered a slight, approving nod as Richard paraded me past the investors. She believed I had capitulated. But then I saw Grace. She was standing near the arched windows, wearing a striking emerald gown that demanded attention. She pointed with her entire hand at the bartender, laughing loudly at a joke, utterly unbothered by the stiff corporate atmosphere. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and the brief flash of a smile crossed her face. The devastating secret from the decrypted email still burned in my mind, but tonight was about Richard. Grace was here, standing as my silent vanguard. "Ah, Marcus," Richard said smoothly, extending a hand to the chairman of the Vanguard board. "I'm glad you could make it." "Richard," Marcus replied, accepting the handshake but keeping his gaze fixed on me. "Sarah, it is surprising to see you here, given the recent rumors." "Rumors are just noise, Marcus," Richard answered quickly, his tone clipped and dismissive. He tightened his hold on my arm. "Sarah and I are fully committed to Vanguard's future." I looked directly at Marcus, letting the cold, forensic fury rise in my chest. I had spent 2 decades smoothing every wrinkle, apologizing for Richard's absences, acting as the invisible shock absorber for his ambition. I was done apologizing. "We are very committed to Vanguard's future," I echoed, letting the bitter flavor of the double meaning coat my tongue. "In fact, I believe the board will find my contribution to the firm's legacy quite unforgettable." Richard shot me a sharp, warning look, the charming sociopath beneath the polished surface, momentarily flashing in his eyes. He didn't grasp the comment, but his instinct for danger was acute. "Excuse me," I said, gently but firmly extracting my arm from his grip. "I need to speak with Grace." I didn't wait for his permission. I walked away, the rough fabric of my gown brushing against the tables. The fear that had kept me chained to him for 14 years was fully eradicated. I was moving with the precision of an executioner. I reached Grace, who immediately handed me a fresh glass of champagne. "Daniel just texted," Grace murmured, her voice dropping the loud bravado. "He filed the whistleblower complaint with the SEC 5 minutes ago. The digital couriers are delivering the evidentiary dossiers to the board members' private suites upstairs right now." I took a slow sip of the champagne, letting the sharp taste burn the back of my throat. I stared across the ballroom at Richard, who was currently laughing at a joke, oblivious to the fact that his empire was already collapsing. The trap had sprung. "It's done," I whispered. But as I watched Marcus pull his phone from his pocket, his face draining of color as he read the urgent notification from the courier service, my gaze drifted back to Grace. The unyielding solidarity I shared with her was complicated by the heavily redacted medical file I had found. If the federal indictment destroyed Richard tonight, what terrifying truth about Grace would be unearthed in the morning's fallout? Emotion. "What did you do, Sarah?" Richard demanded, his warm baritone fracturing into a hoarse, unrecognizable rasp as the murmurs of the crowd swelled into a chaotic roar. I stood in the center of the St. Regis Ballroom, the epicenter of Seattle's corporate wealth. The dark shadows of my 14-year marriage were finally laid bare beneath the blinding golden color of the crystal chandeliers. The sharp scent of panic overpowered the cloying smell of expensive perfume and the stale odor of catered salmon. The air was thick, suffocating to everyone but me. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the familiar physical ache, but there was no pain left to ground me. The suffocating weight of Richard's expectations, the hollow despair of playing the invisible wife, it had all evaporated. An immaculate catharsis washed over me. I was watching the empire of lies burn to the ground, and the warmth of the flames was glorious. I didn't do anything, Richard, I replied, my voice carrying the steady, cold cadence of a judge reading a verdict. The low hum of the ballroom had morphed into a frantic crescendo. I heard the sharp clatter of a silver tray hitting the floor as a waiter bumped into a stunned executive. You did this. You built the Cayman accounts. You forged the compliance logs. You bled our marriage dry. Richard stepped toward me, his hand reaching out to grab my arm. His grip, usually firm and commanding, was trembling. He straightened his cufflinks, a desperate, unconscious tell he used when he was cornered. You are insane. You are having a breakdown. I will have you committed. It's too late for that, I said, leaning closer so only he could hear the whisper. Daniel Park filed the whistleblower complaint with the SEC at 9 o'clock this morning. Marcus and the board just received the fully decrypted server logs. Richard stared at me. The charming sociopath beneath the polished exterior suddenly laid bare. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at me the way a man looks at a ghost he assumed he had buried deep in the ground. Across the room, the crowd parted abruptly. Daniel Park walked through the velvet ropes, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore his standard, slightly rumpled suit, carrying a thick manila folder. Two men in dark windbreakers flanked him, federal agents. Richard Mitchell, Daniel announced, his tone fast and precise, cutting through the chaos like a scythe. He touched the smooth texture of the leather folder. We are executing a federal warrant for the immediate seizure of all Vanguard corporate assets connected to the secondary trust. I watched Marcus, the board chairman, physically distance himself from Richard. The loyalty Richard had purchased with handshake deals and calculated warmth dissolved in an instant. The executives who had fawned over him 10 minutes ago now stared at him with undisguised horror. The bitter flavor of their hypocrisy was intoxicating. Sarah, Eleanor's sharp voice pierced the commotion. I turned to cast a glance at the matriarch standing near the central table. She had lost the serene posture of the victorious grandmother. Her frail hands were no longer clasped in her lap. They gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. The heavy sapphire necklace around my neck suddenly became a trophy rather than a collar. You foolish girl, Eleanor hissed, her grandmotherly facade shattering. She pointed a trembling finger at me. You have destroyed this family. You have ruined Ryan's legacy. No, Eleanor, a new voice answered. Ryan stepped out from behind Daniel, stepping into the harsh light. He was wearing his Vanguard corporate badge, but he wasn't standing with the executives. He walked directly to my side, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. But this time the defensive posture wasn't shielding him from me. He was shielding himself from his father. I gave them the server logs, Grandma, Ryan said, his voice breaking under the agonizing heartbreak of the betrayal, yet anchored by a fierce courage. I gave them the encrypted emails. You and Dad made me an accomplice to federal fraud. The legacy was a lie. Eleanor staggered backward as if she had been physically struck. Richard finally broke, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits, but the federal agents were already moving in. The damp sweat of sheer panic coated his forehead. He reached out to me one last time, a pathetic gesture from a man who had treated my devotion like a depreciating asset. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I just looked at him, embracing the absolute, unyielding fearlessness that comes from having nothing left to lose. I had weaponized my silence, and the resulting detonation was flawless. Take him, Daniel instructed the agents. As they closed in, the rough fabric of Richard's tuxedo strained against the handcuffs. I watched the man who had stolen my ambition, my youth, and my security be escorted out of the ballroom in disgrace. The sheer magnitude of the victory was a heavy, glorious burden. I had won. The war was over. But as the ballroom slowly emptied, leaving only the wreckage of the Mitchell dynasty behind, my phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out, expecting a message from Grace, who had quietly slipped away during the chaos. Instead, it was an encrypted text from Daniel. I dug into the heavily redacted medical file you found. Sarah, Grace wasn't a patient at that facility. She was the primary shareholder. The immaculate catharsis vanished, replaced by a sudden icy dread. If Grace owned the clinic that Richard had been funneling money into 6 years ago, what terrifying secret had she been hiding from me all along? Emotion. It was a rehabilitation clinic, Sarah, Grace said, her voice dropping the loud bravado as she pointed a trembling finger at the decrypted file. I built it for women like us, and Richard invested to keep me quiet about the divorce. I stood in the center of Grace's living room, the morning sun pushing back the dark shadows of the previous night's gala. The warm golden color of the dawn spilled across the hardwood floor. The sharp scent of freshly brewed coffee overpowered the damp odor of the Seattle rain hitting the window panes. The room smelled like a fresh start. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, seeking the familiar physical ache, but my pulse was steady. The paralyzing numbness, the crushing weight of Richard's expectations, the hollow despair of playing the invisible wife, it had all evaporated. In its place, a profound, quiet peace settled over me. He invested in your clinic, I repeated, my tone measured and clinical. The silence in the room stretched. I heard the faint clatter of a ceramic mug as Grace set her coffee down. 6 years ago, when I left my husband, Richard offered me a massive seed investment for the Women's Shelter Project, Grace explained, rubbing the rough texture of her denim jeans. The only condition was that I could never tell you about the offshore structuring he used to fund it. He anticipated you would ask questions. He bought my silence to protect his Cayman accounts. I stared at her, absorbing the staggering reality of her confession. Grace had taken dirty money to build a sanctuary for broken women, sacrificing her honesty with me to secure a lifeline for hundreds of others. The bitter flavor of betrayal flickered briefly in my chest, but it didn't take hold. I looked at the fierce, protective friend who had stood by me during my own collapse. She had witnessed my pain, offering a safe harbor when I was utterly adrift, and that was enough. You used his stolen money to build a fortress, I said, taking a sip from my mug, the rich taste grounding me. You weaponized his arrogance. Grace let out a sudden, wet laugh that filled the room, the comforting sound washing away the tension. I did, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Ryan stepped into the apartment, followed closely by Emma. My 19-year-old daughter twisted the strap of her canvas backpack, a childhood habit she never outgrew. Her eyes were red-rimmed, carrying the devastating quiet grief of a child who had finally seen her father for what he was. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice cracking as she crossed the room. I reached out, pulling her into a tight embrace. The smooth, cold leather of her jacket warmed beneath my touch. I held her fiercely, absorbing the slight tremors shaking her shoulders. Ryan moved to stand beside us, crossing his arms over his chest, but the defensive posture was fully gone. He was no longer the arrogant corporate heir. He was just a son seeking refuge. The federal agents locked down the Vanguard offices at midnight, Ryan said, his tone dropping the public bravado. The board stripped Dad of his title this morning. The SEC froze his remaining personal assets. They are already liquidating the secondary shell companies to pay the compliance fines. He's facing 20 years in federal prison. "Have you spoken to Eleanor?" I asked, watching the subtle shift in his expression. Ryan shook his head. "She refused to leave the estate. She is barricading herself inside, pretending none of this is happening. She told the lawyers that Dad acted alone, but Daniel has the proxy directives with her signature. She is going down with him." "I know," I replied softly, smoothing Emma's hair. The agonizing heartbreak of tearing my family apart was a heavy burden, but it was eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of our survival. We were standing in the wreckage of the Mitchell dynasty, but we were standing together. I had protected my son from becoming a criminal, and I had shielded my daughter from growing up under the thumb of a narcissistic tyrant. I walked over to the glass table and picked up the master dossier. The sheer volume of paper represented 2 decades of calcified ambition, a life spent smoothing every wrinkle for a man who viewed me as a depreciating asset. I had weaponized my silence to dismantle his empire. The cold, forensic fury that had fueled me through the war was fully spent. What happens now, Mama? Emma asked, using the childhood moniker she reserved for moments of absolute vulnerability. She looked at me the way a sailor looks at a lighthouse in a storm. Now, I said, casting a glance at the bright morning sky outside the window, we rebuild. We figure out who we are without him, and we start by not hiding anymore. The suffocating societal judgment that once ruled my every decision meant nothing now. I had walked through the fire, shedding the humiliation of the discarded wife, and emerged with my children and my dignity intact. The intoxicating absence of fear was a glorious reward. Grace walked over, handing each of us a fresh mug of coffee. We stood in a circle, a makeshift family forged in the crucible of Richard's betrayal. I listened to the low hum of the city waking up outside. The war was over. I had orchestrated the ultimate public downfall of a charming sociopath, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the years I assumed were lost. A profound sense of acceptance washed over me, an acceptance of the scars that would forever mark this victory, and a fierce, quiet joy for the unwritten chapters ahead. The past was finally a closed ledger, the oppressive truth was out, and the terrible secret was gone.